the neurologist and clinical neurologist V.S. Ramachandran, in some of his writings and some of his lectures, talks about the biological basis for the aesthetic experience, or the biological basis for art. I make the distinction between art and aesthetic experience because he himself makes that distinction. He acknowledges that art practice is a complex cultural, social, economic phenomenon, only part of which appears to be to do directly with aesthetics, and he says he's talking about aesthetics. And one of the claims that he makes, partially tongue-in-cheek I think, but partially seriously, is that there are clear identifiable biological processes which seem to underpin most aesthetic appreciation or aesthetic awareness within art practice. And he grounds these in adaptive evolutionary behaviours and images. So, for example, he gives the example of the markings on the beak of a certain bird. I can't remember the name of the bird right now. But this bird has a little red dot on its beak. Or I think the mother bird does, certainly. And the baby birds, when they want to get the mother to feed them, they peck at this red dot. It acts as a kind of stimulus for that behaviour. And what scientists have found, Ramachandran says, is that the awareness and stimulus of that red dot and the response that it elicits in the young is so strong that it can be elicited by not just a bird with a red dot on its beak, but pretty much anything that's got a red dot on it. So if someone holds a stick with a red dot on the end towards the bird, towards the baby birds, they'll peck at that. And what's also interesting, he says, or really, really interesting in terms of art practice and aesthetics, he says if you hold a stick that's got 2 red bars painted on it, they'll peck at it even more. They seem to get really excited by it. So this enhancement, or this sort of overstatement of an evolutionarily determined trigger, stimulus, seems to produce a level of arousal and a level of behaviour in the baby birds, which is also overstated. And so he says that's the underpinnings of one of the features of aesthetics, which I think he refers to as peak shift, although I may be picking the wrong one. There's about 10 different factors he goes for, and I think the one I'm referring to here he refers to as peak shift. That not just birds, but all of us are evolutionarily determined to find certain things pleasant or arousing because they would confer some sort of survival advantage to us, in the way that the red dot on the beak of a mother bird or the recognition of that red dot would convey a survival advantage to the young of that particular species. So in humans we have similar sorts of responses, although they're a little bit more complex. And the overstatement, the enhancement, the shifting of those the stimuli, exaggeration of those stimuli, would produce exaggerated responses. So the pleasant feelings or the feelings of arousal that we get from a certain sort of stimuli which historically has given us some sort of survival advantage, an enhancement of that, the exaggeration of that, would produce an exaggeration of those pleasant feelings, or those aroused feelings, and that underpins, he says, the aesthetic response. He doesn't stay just within the realms of art. He also mentions, for example, page 3 pin-ups. Models, really. He says that one of the reasons why, for example, we're particularly attracted as men, at least, to page 3 models is because they have exaggerated features. They have larger breasts than average. They tend to have plumper lips than average. There's all the signs. In other words, what we're seeing when we see those page 3 models, he says, is we're seeing some of the signs in a female that would in the past have signalled fecundity, procreative ability, like breasts, for example, the ability to feed young, and plumped up lips, which apparently are a sign of sexual arousal. We're seeing those stimuli, but we're seeing them in an exaggerated form. So not only do we get this, a sort of basic feeling of attraction, we get an enhanced feeling of attraction, which is leaning against the aesthetic. We don't think of page 3 models usually as aesthetic in an art sense, but according to Ramachandran at least, the underpinning mechanism is the same. There's a certain sort of modification of the stimuli such that our response is similarly exaggerated into the aesthetic. Ramachandran primarily deals with visual practice, visual artworks, once he goes on to artworks. He draws his examples from classical Indian art, for example, but also other areas. And as I say, he's dealing with visual art, and he makes the point, as I've said, of not talking about the conceptual elements, if you like, or the cultural, economic, abstract elements, purely the visual and concrete aspects of the arts practice itself. But I think there is an argument to be made that some of his arguments, some of his mechanisms, could also be applied to the conceptual elements. I mean, certainly, if we think of the ideas which are present in art, we tend often not to think of art as having ideas, but it does. It's completely riddled with ideas. If we think of that, then there should be a case for arguing that the ideas which are being invoked, consciously or non-consciously, could potentially have some sort of aesthetic component. The notion that ideas can be aesthetically pleasing is certainly, if not well documented, at least part of the vernacular of our culture. We do talk about ideas as being beautiful. I know scientists talk about equations being elegant and beautiful, and mathematicians talk about some of their work as being beautiful. And I have no doubt at all that scientists, mathematicians, physicists, biologists, astrophysicists, when they're looking at this, not only when they're looking at the actual physical material of their craft, but when they're thinking about these things, are experiencing aesthetic responses. I'm sure they do get this sense of rapture or awe or the sort of slightly more possibly negative aspects of that. Arousals which are slightly more distressing, but nevertheless are very interesting. Disharmonies, fractures, breaks, deconstructions, destructions. And if physicists and scientists can have an aesthetic relationship to their ideas, then there's no reason, it seems to me, why the ideas which underpin or lie behind a lot of arts practice, and certainly since the beginning of the 20th century, formed a major part of arts practice. If the 20th century has a history of any kind of art, it's the history of the development of concepts in art, then there's no reason why the ideas behind art shouldn't also be beautiful or distressing or arousing in some way. And if they are, it might be interesting to consider how those ideas work in relation to a system such as Ramachandran's mechanisms for the understanding of art. Is there such a thing as a peak shifting of an idea? Can we get an idea which corresponds, or which is analogous to a very large breath on a page 3